The words would haunt every person in that congressional chamber for months afterward. She didn't need freedom, she needed care. Representative Jasmine Crockett had just finished presenting surveillance footage of a 7-year-old girl dying in a Florida emergency room, while staff verified insurance eligibility. The image froze on screen, a mother collapsed over her child's still form, as Florida Governor Ron DeSantis sat in calculated silence, his carefully constructed narrative of fiscal responsibility crumbling under the weight of documented death. What had begun as routine budget testimony had transformed into something far more consequential, a moral reckoning with the human cost of political ideology disguised as freedom. The chamber fell silent as America confronted the true price of its most seductive political promise. The House Budget Committee chamber carried the familiar weight of partisan theater, that October morning sunlight streaming through tall windows onto mahogany tables where representatives shuffled through prepared talking points. Governor Ron DeSantis appeared via video link from Tallahassee, his office carefully staged with Florida state flags and leather-bound volumes that spoke to executive authority. His presentation began with the confidence of a man who had transformed an entire state into a conservative showcase. DeSantis commanded the room through the screen, his voice carrying presidential timbre as he outlined Florida's fiscal transformation. The slides behind him painted triumph in ascending graphs, budget surpluses climbing steadily upward, federal dependency rates plummeting toward zero unemployment figures that made other governors envious. Each chart reinforced the same narrative. Florida had achieved what Republican theory promised was possible. Smaller government yielded greater prosperity, personal responsibility rewarded with genuine results. The centerpiece of his presentation focused on Medicaid reform, where Florida had reduced expansion by 38% over 2 years while maintaining what DeSantis characterized as essential services for those who truly required assistance. He spoke of streamlined SNAP benefits that eliminated fraud and dependency of job training programs that moved people from government reliance to self-sufficiency. Every statistic supported his central thesis: when government stepped back, human potential stepped forward. Representative Jasmine Crockett observed from her position, 3 seats from the ranking member, her notepad filling with observations rather than objections. She studied DeSantis with the focused attention of a prosecutor cataloging testimony, noting every claim, every carefully chosen phrase, every assumption embedded in his worldview. Her staff had spent 3 months preparing for this moment, assembling boxes of documents that told a different story about Florida's miracle. But she understood the power of allowing an opponent to construct his own trap. DeSantis advanced to his signature slide, the formula that had become his governing philosophy rendered in bold lettering: personal freedom equals fiscal stability. The equation appeared simple, almost mathematical in its certainty. When government trusted people to make their own choices, when bureaucrats resisted the urge to create dependency, prosperity followed naturally for everyone. The Republican committee members nodded approvingly, recognizing their champion, proving that conservative governance worked in practice, not merely in campaign rhetoric. The presentation continued, with testimonials from Florida business owners praising regulatory relief video clips of former welfare recipients who had found employment after benefit reduction statistics showing decreased crime rates in areas where social programs had been eliminated. DeSantis had constructed what appeared to be comprehensive evidence that less government interference meant more human flourishing, that individual liberty and collective prosperity were not competing values, but complementary forces. Crockett made a single notation in her margin as DeSantis concluded, "Stability for whom? She had learned patience in the Texas legislature, where grandstanding often backfired and careful preparation trumped theatrical outrage. The governor was building his philosophical case methodically, each piece of evidence, supporting his belief that government assistance created more problems than it solved. He spoke of breaking cycles of dependency and empowering individual choice with the fervor of someone who genuinely believed his own rhetoric about human dignity requiring self-reliance. The committee's initial questions followed predictable patterns. Republican members offered congratulations and inquiries about replicating Florida's success in their own states, receiving equally predictable responses about the importance of political courage and long-term thinking. Democratic members posed standard objections about poverty rates and healthcare access, which DeSantis deflected with references to employment statistics and budget stability. The familiar dance of partisan inquiry proceeded without surprise until Crockett's turn arrived. Her first question carried none of the confrontational energy that usually characterized such hearings. She simply observed that DeSantis had presented impressive data about reduced state spending on social programs, then noted a curious omission in his comprehensive presentation. Where she wondered was the data about what happened to the people who had been removed from those programs. The question hung in the air with deceptive simplicity, carrying implications that would soon transform the entire proceeding. DeSantis responded to Crockett's inquiry with practiced smoothness, explaining that individuals removed from Medicaid roles had been transitioned to employment-based health care or private market options through job training programs and career counseling services. The goal, he emphasized, had always been moving people from dependence to independence, a noble objective that resonated with fundamental American values about self-reliance and personal responsibility. Crockett acknowledged his answer with apparent thoughtfulness before advancing her own presentation. Her first slide appeared on the chamber's main screen without the polished graphics of DeSantis's materials, stark black and white bar charts that carried the weight of government data rather than political messaging. The graph revealed a 23% increase in emergency room visits by uninsured patients across Florida hospitals during the same 2-year period that Medicaid rolls had decreased. More disturbing was the correlation shown in a second chart. Emergency room deaths among uninsured patients had increased by 15% during identical timeframes. These numbers represented people who could no longer afford preventive medical care. Crockett explained individuals who had received what DeSantis called the freedom to choose their healthcare providers. Unfortunately for many of them, that choice had narrowed to emergency rooms, or nothing at all. When DeSantis attempted to dismiss the correlation by citing Florida's population growth, Crockett calmly noted that her statistics were adjusted per capita. The rate of increase in emergency deaths among uninsured patients far exceeded demographic changes. The presentation shifted from abstract statistics to human specificity, with the appearance of a photograph. Maria Santos, a 34-year-old mother of 2 from Jacksonville, standing with her children outside what appeared to be a school. The image transformed data into recognizable humanity, a working mother with tired eyes but determined posture, exactly the kind of person politicians claimed to represent. Maria had lost her job as a hotel housekeeper when her employer reduced staff, and under Florida's revised Medicaid guidelines, she no longer qualified for coverage during unemployment, despite having worked steadily for years. Maria's 7-year-old daughter Isabella had managed type 1 diabetes since age 4 through careful medical supervision that included regular endocrinologist visits, precise insulin dosing, and continuous monitoring. When Maria lost employment, the family also lost access to Isabella's pediatric care. The transition DeSantis described from government dependence to self-sufficiency had meant in practical terms that a diabetic child could no longer see her doctor or afford her medication through any systematic means. Crockett's next slides documented Maria's repeated attempts to navigate Florida's streamlined bureaucracy, 3 Medicaid applications over 5 months, each denied, not because Isabella wasn't sick enough, but because the family's income fluctuated too much to meet new eligibility requirements. Maria worked temporary cleaning jobs with irregular schedules, meaning her income varied week to week in ways that disqualified her from programs designed to help working families. The documentation included copies of official Florida Department of Health correspondence denial letters, stamped with state seals form responses, explaining that applications did not meet current guidelines. On August 15th of this previous year, Isabella experienced a severe hypoglycemic episode at school that required immediate emergency intervention. The school nurse called an ambulance, but the nearest hospital emergency room operated at capacity-forcing transportation to a second facility, where staff spent precious minutes determining insurance coverage before beginning treatment. The delay proved fatal. Isabella Santos died at 3:47 a.m. on August 16, 2023, from diabetic ketoacidosis, a completely preventable condition when proper medication and monitoring remain available. Crockett's final slide in this sequence displayed Isabella's death certificate from Duval County, Florida. The child's name clearly visible at the top of official documentation. The cause of death, printed in clinical language, represented the end result of policy decisions made in air-conditioned government offices by people who would never face the consequences of their choices. A 7-year-old girl had died because Florida's reformed system prioritized administrative efficiency over medical necessity. The challenge Crockett posed to DeSantis was direct and personal when he spoke of personal freedom and fiscal stability. How did he account for Isabella Santos? Was her death the intended price of Florida's budget success, or simply an unfortunate side effect of people learning to stand on their own? The question exposed the moral vacuum at the heart of his governing philosophy, the assumption that individual tragedies were acceptable casualties in the larger war against government dependency. DeSantis attempted to maintain his ideological framework by characterizing Isabella's death as tragic but irrelevant to broader policy considerations. Every death was unfortunate, he argued, but governance could not be based on individual cases when broader reforms had helped thousands of Floridians achieve self-sufficiency. The response revealed the essential callousness of his position. A dead child was simply collateral damage in the noble cause of fiscal responsibility. Crockett's rebuttal cut through his abstraction with surgical precision. Isabella Santos had never been given the opportunity to become self-sufficient. She was 7 years old. Her mother had been working multiple jobs, desperately trying to support her family through Florida's reformed system. What they needed wasn't self-sufficiency training or lectures about personal responsibility. They needed health care for a diabetic child whose life depended on medication that cost $20 but required a prescription that cost thousands. The confrontation reached its critical juncture as DeSantis attempted to regain narrative control by returning to his fundamental argument about the dignity of self-reliance. His voice carried slight irritation as he insisted that governance could not be based on emotional anecdotes, no matter how compelling individual stories might appear. Florida's reforms had created jobs, reduced spending, and provided tools for independence rather than abandoning anyone to government neglect. Crockett had anticipated exactly this response and was prepared to demolish it with DeSantis's own data. Her next sequence focused on the specific tools he claimed to provide, beginning with job training programs that were supposed to ease transitions away from Medicaid dependency. The numbers told a devastating story of approximately 89,000 people removed from Medicaid eligibility. Only 412 had completed the job training programs. DeSantis touted a completion rate of less than half of 1%. The budget allocations proved even more damning. Florida had allocated $2.3 million for employment transition services, but spent only $340,000, with remaining funds redirected to administrative costs and contractor fees. The tools for independence that DeSantis emphasized in his presentation existed primarily as budget line items that looked impressive in political speeches but served fewer than 1 in 200 people who actually lost coverage. Crockett then displayed the bureaucratic labyrinth that constituted Florida's streamlined application process for emergency Medicaid. The flowchart revealed a system that would challenge someone with legal training, much less a working parent managing a medical crisis. Applicants required pay stubs from the previous 6 months' proof of residency documentation of medical necessity, verification of asset levels, and confirmation of citizenship status. Average processing time ranged from 4 to 6 weeks, with appeals adding another 2 to 3 months to an already impossible timeline. When Isabella Santos lay dying in that emergency room, her mother possessed all required documentation except pay stubs from 6 months earlier because she had been employed full-time until 3 months before the medical crisis. The system DeSantis designed to eliminate fraud had instead eliminated a child whose only crime was having a mother whose employment history didn't align perfectly with bureaucratic requirements during a life-threatening emergency. The accusation became direct and personal in ways that political discourse rarely achieved. DeSantis was no longer defending abstract policy principles, but was being forced to justify a specific child's death as a necessary consequence of his administrative reforms. His attempt to characterize Crockett's presentation as unfair revealed the moral bankruptcy of treating preventable deaths as acceptable outcomes of proper governance. Crockett's most devastating evidence appeared as a map of Florida dotted with red markers representing hospitals where emergency room visits by uninsured patients had increased dramatically since Medicaid reforms began. Jacksonville General Hospital showed a 47% increase. Miami-Dade County Hospital, 52%. Tampa General, 39%. Orlando Regional, 44%. The statistics accumulated like a coroner's report documenting how DeSantis's reforms had simply shifted healthcare costs from prevention to emergency intervention, from manageable chronic care to crisis management. The map dissolved into an itemized hospital bill for $47,000, the charges for Isabella Santos's final emergency room visit. Every line item represented an attempt to save her life: medications, procedures, tests, all administered too late to matter. The bill had been sent to Maria Santos 6 weeks after her daughter's funeral, and she was currently working 3 part-time jobs to make payments on debt incurred trying to save a child who died because Florida's streamlined system proved too complex for a grieving mother to navigate during a medical emergency. Crockett's direct challenge to DeSantis exposed the hollow cruelty of his governing philosophy. He had used the word freedom 17 times during his presentation, she noted. But could he explain what freedom had meant for the Santos family? The freedom to watch a daughter die while insurance eligibility was being verified. The freedom to declare bankruptcy, paying for funeral expenses and medical bills that could have been prevented with accessible health care. The chamber fell into complete silence as the human cost of ideological purity became undeniable. Even Republican committee members found themselves unable to defend what they were witnessing, recognizing that their champion had just been systematically stripped of every moral justification for policies that killed children in the name of fiscal responsibility. DeSantis's final attempt to maintain his position, insisting that tragic individual cases could not drive system-wide decisions, revealed the fundamental heartlessness of treating preventable deaths as acceptable casualties in the war against government dependency. His claim that Florida's reforms were based on evidence and best practices had been thoroughly demolished by evidence of 15 preventable deaths in a single year, all connected to delays and denials in emergency medical coverage that prioritized administrative efficiency over human survival. The chamber had fallen into the profound silence that occurs when political theater transforms into moral reckoning. Crockett stood at the witness table with a manila folder that represented her final piece of evidence, the culmination of months of investigation that would leave no doubt about the human cost of Florida's reforms. Her request for 2 minutes of uninterrupted time carried the gravity of someone prepared to deliver testimony that would haunt everyone present. The disc she removed from the folder contained security footage from Jacksonville General Hospital, recorded during the hours when Isabella Santos died. Hospital administrators had provided the footage as part of congressional investigation into emergency care delays related to insurance verification processes, documentation that revealed the precise moment when policy became death sentence for a 7-year-old girl. The main screen flickered to life with grainy black and white surveillance footage time-stamped 11:47 p.m., August 15, 2023. The image showed Maria Santos bursting through automatic doors of the emergency room entrance, carrying her unconscious daughter in arms that shook with desperation. Even in poor-quality security footage, the maternal panic was unmistakable as she ran toward the reception desk, her mouth moving frantically as she spoke to staff invisible in the camera's limited frame. Isabella had been unconscious for 40 minutes by this point, Crockett explained quietly, her narration providing context for the unfolding tragedy. The footage continued in real-time silence as Maria paced frantically in the waiting area, occasionally returning to the reception desk, gesturing toward her limp child, while other patients and family members began to notice the crisis developing before them. Emergency room staff were attempting to verify Isabella's insurance eligibility during these crucial minutes following hospital policy that required confirmation of coverage before beginning treatment for conditions classified as urgent but not immediately life-threatening. 12 minutes passed, on screen 12 eternal minutes of a mother holding her dying child, while administrative processes unfolded with bureaucratic indifference to human suffering. Medical staff finally appeared in the frame at 12:03 a.m., taking Isabella from Maria's arms, and disappearing through doors marked with emergency signage. By that time, the child's blood sugar levels had dropped to critically dangerous levels that would prove irreversible. 16 minutes of delay in treating diabetic ketoacidosis had transformed a manageable medical crisis into a death sentence. The screen went black momentarily before resuming with different camera angle from inside the emergency treatment area. This footage proved more difficult to witness as medical personnel worked frantically around a small figure on a gurney while Maria Santos pressed against the wall, her hands covering her face, in recognition that her daughter was slipping away despite the skilled care being provided. The timestamp advanced through the night. AM 2:33, AM 3:21, AM. As medical activity around Isabella's gurney gradually decreased from frantic intervention to resigned acceptance. At 3:47 a.m., the screen captured the moment when Maria Santos learned that her daughter was dead. Her complete breakdown visible even in silent black and white surveillance footage that transformed policy abstraction into unbearable human reality. Crockett stopped the video and removed the disc, leaving the final frame frozen on screen. Maria Santos hunched over her daughter's still form, her world having ended in a sterile hospital room, while insurance eligibility remained unresolved. The chamber experienced the kind of silence that follows moral catastrophe when the gap between political rhetoric and human consequence becomes too wide to bridge with ideology. When Crockett spoke again, her voice barely rose above a whisper, but the chamber's acoustics carried every word with crystal clarity. Isabella Santos hadn't needed freedom from government dependency, or job training, or career counseling, or lessons in self-reliance, she observed. The child hadn't needed budget savings, or fiscal efficiency, or streamlined bureaucracy designed to eliminate fraud and waste. She had needed insulin, $20 worth of medication that required a prescription accessible only through healthcare coverage that Florida's reforms had eliminated. She had needed immediate medical care administered without delays caused by insurance verification. She had needed a system that prioritized saving her life over checking paperwork, that recognized healthcare as a human necessity rather than a commodity to be rationed according to administrative convenience. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds as the committee absorbed the full weight of what they had witnessed. Isabella Santos had needed care, Crockett concluded. Nothing more complicated than that. She had simply needed care that her government had decided she couldn't afford. The aftermath of Crockett's presentation settled over the chamber like fallout from an explosion contaminating every subsequent attempt to return to normal political discourse. DeSantis remained on screen, his usually composed features showing strain that no amount of media training could conceal. Committee members sat in stunned recognition that they had witnessed something beyond typical partisan confrontation, a moral reckoning that would define healthcare debates for years to come. Chairman Williams attempted to restore procedural normalcy by offering DeSantis opportunity to respond, but the governor found himself trapped in an impossible position. Any defense of policy requirements would appear callous after the footage the committee had witnessed, while any criticism of hospital implementation would undermine his argument that reforms were working as designed. His response that tragic individual cases could not drive policy decisions affecting millions felt hollow and defensive, the words of a man who had been systematically stripped of moral authority. Crockett remained standing because she sensed the moment required one final observation that would cement the moral framework she had constructed. DeSantis continued referring to Isabella Santos as an individual tragedy she noted, as if her death were somehow separate from his policy choices. But the child hadn't been an exception to his system. She had been its direct result. The delays that killed her were built into the streamlined process he had designed features, rather than flaws of reforms he had personally signed into law. The policy document outlining Florida's Medicaid eligibility requirements specifically stated that emergency coverage required verification before treatment could begin for non-life-threatening conditions. Isabella's diabetes complications had been classified as urgent but not immediately life-threatening, placing her directly in the administrative gap that DeSantis had created between bureaucratic efficiency and medical necessity. His policy, his signature, his choice had killed a 7-year-old girl. When Republican Representative Johnson from Ohio asked whether DeSantis planned to modify eligibility requirements in light of the testimony, the governor faced a crucial decision point. He could acknowledge problems and promise solutions, demonstrating the flexibility that effective governance required. Instead, he doubled down on ideology, insisting that Florida's reforms were working despite individual tragedies that could not dictate policy for an entire state. The response sealed his political fate by revealing the moral bankruptcy at the heart of his governing philosophy. By characterizing Isabella Santos's death as merely an emotional appeal rather than policy consequence, DeSantis demonstrated that his commitment to fiscal responsibility exceeded his concern for human life. Several Republican committee members visibly winced at his choice of words, recognizing that their party's showcase governor had just destroyed himself more effectively than any Democratic attack could have accomplished. Within hours, video clips from the hearing circulated on social media platforms with viral intensity. The hashtag Isabella Santos began trending nationally, accompanied by security footage of Maria Santos carrying her dying daughter into the emergency room. The image of desperate maternal love became the human face of healthcare reform debates, transforming abstract policy discussions into visceral moral arguments that transcended partisan boundaries. Editorial boards from major newspapers published scathing critiques of Florida's Medicaid reforms, while conservative commentators found themselves defending child deaths as necessary for fiscal responsibility, a position that proved politically untenable even for audiences committed to limited government principles. Progressive voices seized on Isabella's story as definitive proof of their arguments about healthcare as human right rather than market commodity. Perhaps most significantly, Republican governors in other states who had planned similar reforms quietly began revising their proposals. The political cost of defending policies that killed photogenic children proved too high, even for politicians ideologically committed to reducing government spending. Isabella Santos had become more than victim of misguided policy. She had become the human face of every political decision that prioritized ideological purity over vulnerable lives. 3 weeks after the hearing, Maria Santos received notification from the Florida Department of Health that her daughter's case had been reviewed and would have qualified for emergency Medicaid coverage under revised guidelines being implemented immediately. The new policy eliminated waiting periods for children with chronic conditions and streamlined verification processes for emergency situations, changes that came 18 months too late for Isabella, but would prevent other children from dying in the administrative gap between urgent and critical care. Governor DeSantis announced the modifications in a brief press release that made no mention of Isabella Santos or the congressional hearing framing changes as improvements to an already successful system, while quietly acknowledging the human cost of his earlier policies. The reform had been written in a child's blood purchased with a 7-year-old's life, as the price of learning what should have been obvious from the beginning. Congresswoman Crockett welcomed the changes while noting they represented admission that original policies had been fatally flawed. Isabella Santos had deserved better than to become the sacrifice that taught this lesson, she observed. But if her death prevented other children from dying while bureaucrats checked paperwork, perhaps some meaning could emerge from senseless tragedy. The hearing had exposed fundamental truth about American governance policies are always implemented on real people with real consequences in real time. The abstraction of budget numbers and efficiency metrics dissolves when confronted with surveillance footage of a mother carrying her dying child into an emergency room. Isabella Santos had transcended her role as policy victim to become the moral standard by which every subsequent healthcare decision would be measured. In the end, Crockett had accomplished something rare in contemporary politics, forcing policy change through moral argument rather than partisan pressure. The hearing demonstrated that even in an era of deep political division, the image of a dying child could still shock the system into recognizing its obligations to the most vulnerable members of society. Isabella Santos would never benefit from reforms her death had prompted, but other children would live because she had died. Their survival would stand as the only meaningful monument to a 7-year-old girl who had needed nothing more complicated than insulin and the promise that her government would not let her die while adults debated the proper role of bureaucracy in human suffering. The freedom to neglect had finally encountered its moral limit in the image of a child dying, while politicians calculated the fiscal benefits of her death.